And sharing. Okay, so last night we went, let me go back and show you the, well, maybe I can go forward. No, I can't. I'll carry it all the way back so you can see the verse we're working with next. We're in the next verse of the Song of Songs, chapter 2, which is verse 15. And it says, catch the foxes for us, the little foxes that are ruining the vineyards while our vineyards are in blossom. So our setting hasn't moved from the previous verses. We're still in the springtime. We're still at the time of the blossoming vineyard, which is going to be around the time of Pesach, the spring feasts leading up to Shavuot. Pesach is not really concluded until Shavuot, by the way, just they're connected there by the counting of the weeks. But we're still in the same setting. We're still in the same time period, and therefore we're still looking at Egypt. What are we supposed to learn from the Exodus from Egypt that is going to inform us later in situations like Revelation describes, being, told to come out of Babylon? Well, what does Babylon have to do with Egypt? Well, they all have something to do with one another. And it's not just the image of the beast in those four kingdoms. There's, in terms of Israel's troubles and tribulations, there's going to be prophecy that is spoken over many of these nations. Some of them, Israel had a very minimal intersection with them, like say Hiram of Tyre, who supplied the cedar for the temple, was part of King Solomon's economic expansion program. There's not a huge intersection there, but nevertheless, they take a pretty prominent role in prophecy in terms of the more apocalyptic prophecies that do concern the king of Babylon, Assyria, and so forth, and of course, Egypt. So you think, well, there's something more going on here than just this particular ruler at this particular time in this particular place. And that's why Egypt is still informing in every generation. If each generation had learned the lessons of Egypt, it probably could have minimized the tribulation in their generation. I think of the Holocaust and how gradually the heat was turned up, but nevertheless, the messages were unmistakable. You couldn't miss what Hitler had in mind if you listened seriously to his speeches. And it's kind of like, Israel's philosophy today is if somebody says they intend to kill you, then believe them. We tend to kind of, push it off and say, oh, they're just posturing, they're just spouting off, they're just saying this or that, they don't really mean it. Well, of course they mean it. You don't say things you don't mean. Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Of course, there's always a chance when you hear those words come out to say, ooh, I don't want that to be in my heart. Let me repent of that. But in most cases, when you keep hearing that message time after time after time after time, we want to kill you. We want to enslave you. We want to take your babies on the birthing stools. Believe them. They may not do it immediately, but if they keep preaching it and teaching it and spreading it, it doesn't matter whether what they're saying is true or not. People will believe it after they hear it so many times, if they don't have the measure of the word to measure it against. And, if you'd recognize those signs, some people did, they got out of Germany. They got out of places that fell to the Nazis, the most rapidly. But some of those that weren't taken, until later in World War II, they were still sitting there believing it wasn't going to happen to them. And so we need to look back the way the sages are, starting the narrative of Song of Songs in Egypt repeatedly, to say there's lessons there that are going to extend to all generations. And so if the plan of Egypt was to kill the babies, basically somewhere between in utero and being born, if that was plan A and that wasn't working, they said, okay, we'll go ahead and let them be born, but we'll throw them into the river. If somebody's trying to kill you, believe them. Is there evidence out there that there is a belief system in place that would like to kill children even before birth? Yes. Is there a system out there that wants to capture our children after they're born? Yes. That, the river and the floods often in scripture, and I'm totally off script here, they often represent a flood of wickedness, just like in Noah's flood. The water itself represented the flood of wickedness that had swept across the world. And therefore, he judged the flood with the flood. And so this is the idea here is, if we throw these baby boys in the river, the representation is we can flood Israel with a flood of wickedness. And that's why I'd asked last night's class, if they had time before they listened to the recording for today, to read Ezekiel 20, to see how far Israel had descended into idolatry at that time. It wasn't like Israel was sitting there just pristine, very holy and sanctified and set apart, waiting for their deliverer to come. That wasn't the case at all. They were very much infected with idolatry. They were very much being in danger of being swept under this flood, not just of the physical annihilation of the baby boys in the Nile, but of the wicked spiritual annihilation of idolatry that was sweeping through them. And so measure for measure, it's what we see happening in the natural world with the baby boys is telling us the danger is also in the spiritual realm, that Israel's about to be swept under. Its future is about to be swept under. Its potential warriors are about to be swept under. Its potential clan of priests are about to be swept under. And apart from the intervention of the Holy Spirit and a very courageous little sister or big sister for Moses, that's the danger. And so when you see these tides of public opinion, pay attention to them. They might sweep past you, but they might sweep you up. And so we have to have a lot of wisdom, like Yeshua said, be as wise as a serpent, harmless as a dove. Make sure you don't get swept up into that flood of wickedness. Again, it kind of goes back to, what are we bringing in the house? If you're listening to music that you can tell from the lyrics it's designed to kill you spiritually, then you don't need that in your house, flooding through your house. Same thing with these programs. If it's teaching you values, anti-Torah values, then again, you've got to be prudent and say, I don't want a flood of wickedness coming through my house. Let me get rid of this. There might be friends. They might have been good friends for the good old days, but they may not be friends for today's. There might need to be a separation so that you don't get sucked under into maybe a form of idolatry that you practiced before. And idolatry is not bowing down to just images. It's bowing down to your self-will, saying whatever my appetite wants, whatever it calls for, that's what I'll do. And basically putting the will of Adonai on hold. We don't put him on hold, even though we do. As we're growing up, we reach a stage and we say, well, I'll put Adonai's will on hold for a while and I'll enjoy the world for a little while. That's dangerous. There's going to be a certain point in every generation where that's going to be a dangerous mindset, because you may not have time to reset if you're playing that sort of little foxy game. So the Egyptians are going to be the foxes. And the reason that they're alluded to foxes in a nutshell is because they're not that strong a kingdom, but they're a smart kingdom. They're an intelligent kingdom. To this day, we look at the wonders of the world. We look at the mathematical calculations of the pyramids. We look at their architecture, so much of it that even endures to this day, the artwork and so forth. So there is an intelligence associated with Egypt, and they had periods of strong military power. But just the idea that a pharaoh that title has persisted down through ages, it doesn't mean that the individual kingdoms of the Pharaoh persisted. You'll hear it referred to in terms of dynasties, that these dynasties, they didn't go into perpetuity. There was always some sort of intrigue, turmoil, murder, hostile takeover, coups, those sorts of things that were happening. And so they never attained the military might of, say, a Babylon or a Persia or a Greece or Rome. Their strength was primarily in their cunning. And they managed to manipulate these kingdoms in many cases for survival, which is what the fox does. He's an observer. And that's what we went over last night, is why the fox? Why is it this symbol? Why not a wolf pack or a pride of lions? It's because the fox is an observer. He's cunning. In the same way that Pharaoh says, hey, let's deal shrewdly with the Israelites. He doesn't say let's overpower them. He says, let's be wise. Let's try to outwise God. And of course, we're at a point now in the Torah portions where we can see that just didn't work. You can't outwise wisdom, because he is wisdom. The Holy One, he is wisdom and understanding and counsel and power and knowledge and reverence. How are you going to outspirit the Spirit? You won't. So we went over their habits. We looked at Exodus 14:21 through 31 from our Torah portion as kind of a guideline about how the Israelites went through on dry land, and the seas formed a wall on either side of them to go through, and then how the Egyptians were drawn into it, thinking they're coming in there on dry land, but instead their judgment has already been measured out in that place. And we'll catch up to that, hopefully, pretty soon. We went over the nomenclature in Hebrew of the fox. Where'd it go? Shua, right here. This is something to pack away. And what I want you to pack away here is the two Hebrew spellings that are offered of Shua for the fox, because one of them has a vav in it and one of them doesn't have a vav in it. But the essence of the vav, he's a burrower. He hollows out his home. He establishes a home base, and because he's a wise observer, this is how he protects his territory and his home base. So there's an upside to being a fox. He's a protector of home and territory. But again, he has some qualities that aren't so good. Just like I was telling last night's class, how my neighbors here got cleaned out last week by a fox overnight, killed every hen and only left a rooster with no hens. That's got to be an unhappy rooster. But the root of it is sha'ah, which means to gaze, to inspect, to consider. He's an observer. He's shrewd, and he doesn't catch his prey by being the strongest, the fastest. He catches his prey by being intelligent, having, it's an animal intelligence, it's a predatory intelligence, but it's what the Holy One put in him to keep him alive. And then we looked at the verb form, the shoresh, shoal, which means, again, to hollow out, or the palm of the hand, because the palm of your hand is kind of the hollow of it. Okay, so Pharaoh says, let's deal wisely with them, which goes back to the seven spirits of Adonai that moved on the 7 days of creation. And the first spirit that moved, we're told, is chokhmah, wisdom. And so Pharaoh basically throws down the gauntlet, throws down the glove. He throws something down. I think run the gauntlet, throwing down the something. Oh, I get my sayings mixed up. At any rate, this is what Pharaoh does to the Holy One. And the way that they had kind of tried to take control of Israel, to seize them, is the context of the fox in the Song of Songs. It like seize. This is what needs to be done to the fox. He needs to be seized because he's ruining the blossoms. He's ruining the promise of repentance and good deeds to come that were in the land when Moses and Aaron arrived. And then we made the point, of course, because he's smart, if you control the doorway of your prey, you don't have to be strong. You can control an entire city if you control the gate. And this is what the fox does. Through his power of observation, he basically shut the door to the Israelites. He shut the door to their coming and their going. So he didn't have to be powerful. His concern was he wasn't powerful enough to stop the Israelites should they be invaded and the Israelites join up with an enemy army. He already knew the weakness of his army. So he says, let's deal wisely then. If we don't have the strength, then let's apply some wisdom here and we can control them with cunning. And we can see what the real issue was as it came to a release from slavery for the Israelites. It had to do with the feasts, because time and again, Moses and Aaron go back to Pharaoh and said, release the people so that we can go celebrate a feast. And then the negotiation starts. Well, who's going? Well, everybody's going. No, not everybody. Just take them in. No, we're not going to just take them in. You know, we're going to take the women and the children. No, don't take the women and the children. Yeah, okay, yes, we're going to take the women and the children. Then what? Okay, we're going to take the livestock. We're going to take all the livestock. No, you're not going to take that. And back and forth it goes. And this kind of, it sounds a little insane in hindsight, but I think the point here is Pharaoh knows if the entire nation goes out to celebrate the feast, his power is broken. See, if you can pull and suck people down into idolatry, they will celebrate with you, with your feasts and your Sabbaths and your diet, your things that are offered to idol, your meat, your wine. And instead of consecrating meat and wine to the Holy One, they will begin to merge these ideas. And so you can prevent them from truly observing the feasts of the Holy One, which was Moses' whole thing. This is what he's saying. We got to go do this. We got to, in fact, a plague's going to come on us if we don't do this. He's telling Pharaoh they already knew something about the feasts. And if they didn't keep them, a plague would come upon them. He doesn't even say Pharaoh. He doesn't say Pharaoh, a plague's going to come on you if we don't keep the feast. He says the plague's going to come on us. So they know to do it. It's not something they don't know about. Somewhere in there, they know at least a minimal understanding of the feasts, which I think goes back to the sacrifices that Cain and Abel made. They knew to bring sacrifices at Sukkot. They already knew that. Where did they learn that? Probably from Adam and Eve. Well, where did they learn it? Well, there's lots of history in these lies that we're not given. But you can surmise, from the behavior that, yeah, they knew to do that. You can surmise from what Moses and Aaron are saying to Pharaoh, yeah, they know to go celebrate a feast to Adonai. They don't say which one, but we know which one frees them from the slavery of Pharaoh, from the possession of the fox, and that's going to be Pesach. That's the one that will set them free. So now that brings us to the next lesson. That's your nutshell. So the fox is an observer. And this is the kind of a long passage. I'm going to read parts of it, and I wish you would read the whole chapter if you haven't had time. But it goes back to this idea of Moses and Aaron's confrontation with Pharaoh repeatedly about letting the people go to celebrate a feast. Because in a previous lesson, I think Scott Aaron pointed this out in an email to me. It refers to pretty much two wildernesses. It talks about the wilderness of Egypt and then the wilderness of the peoples, implying that there might be two separate things to look at. They're both a wilderness, but there's two aspects. So the wilderness of Egypt was something that occurred within Egypt while they are still in slavery. But then he calls them out into the wilderness of the people. And what Scott pointed out is people there in that context is It's not like the Gelim. It's not like the nations out there. Is often associated with Yisrael, the people of Israel. So out in this wilderness beyond Egypt, once they've escaped Egypt, they enter into another kind of wilderness. There was a wilderness in Egypt. I think this is a wilderness we're in. And there's a wilderness of the people that is yet to come. There is still to be another reckoning, another level of testing. Once you get out there to celebrate the feast, what's going to happen? Once you're totally free to do it, what's going to happen? Once you're totally free to keep the covenant, will you then still do it? Or if you have made excuses up to that point, once you're in that ideal situation, so to speak, there's nothing to constrain you from it. Will you continue along that path? So the idea that I finished with last night is, if you're being called to the feasts and the Sabbaths and the covenant, the dietary laws, all that stuff, being kind to your neighbor, being kind to your neighbor's donkey, everything, 613 commandments, you may not be able to keep every one of them because some of them don't apply to you. You know, there's man commandments, woman commandments, child commandments, animal commandments, farming commandments, business commandments, temple commandments. There's all sorts of commandments. So there's a smaller number that applies to us each individually, but we study them all. And the idea is if you commit yourself to studying them, it is as if you kept them. But by parceling them out, it shows it takes the body of Messiah to actually complete the Torah in any given generation. But if we're being called to that at this point, in this generation, something that really hasn't happened on a large scale since the first century, where non-Jews, people of uncertain ancestry, maybe, were called to the Torah. And then something happened in the region ruled prophetically by Gog. If we look at where the trouble spots are, a lot of them are up in the area of where Turkey is today. Part of the Byzantine Empire later, once Rome is overthrown, Constantine has his vision. You've got a transformation of these beast kingdoms into religious kingdoms. The real trouble spots, it seems, as we look at who the epistles are addressed to and who John is addressing the cautions to, most of these churches were in the area that would be considered the territory of Gog, which was referred to as Meshech and Tubal, same area. And this is where that transformation came, separation came between Christian, Gentile believers for the most part, and Jewish believers. Where they chose to go at that point in history, we're not told. I'm assuming there was some cross-pollination in both directions. There's so many things in the Mishnah that's kind of screaming it came from Yeshua's disciples. I think there was an influence there because the Jerusalem Council points out how many Jews have believed. And so that influence is going to be passed on, of course, into the scholarship of the day, and therefore, into successive days. You can see some of the things that Yeshua said incorporated in terms of even Sabbath observance. But if this is happening, that tells you that the blossoms are on the grapevine. The blossoms aren't ripe yet, but there's blossoms on the grapevine. There's blossoms on the vineyard of Israel. And this is associated again with the appointed time of Pesach, that season. If we are hearing the appointed times, especially if we feel like we had descended to some level of idolatry, and maybe it's just we didn't understand. Imagine Hebrew children being born, and as the generations go on, there's less and less that the parents can pass on to their children because it tends to fade. We can see that. I mean, if we were to compare a generation that were adults in 1940 to the generation of adults today, there would be a huge disparity in what they know, what they practiced, what they understood, what their ethics were, their worldview, all those things. You can't sweep with a broad brush, but if you look at prevalent belief and practice, And in many cases, you don't need to go any farther than a public school. You can tell in a public school what's happening in a society. And that's why the idea that they were sending Egyptian school children into the Israelite women's bathhouses as spies, and this is not in scripture, it's in the Midrash. You say, well, how would they know that the Israelite women were pregnant and about when they would give birth to try to seize the babies? Well, they recruited school children, they say, of the Egyptians, and they could kind of hang out wherever they wanted to. And they would send them in there very innocently. Nobody thinks a kid's up to anything. And they would observe, and they could tell by looking at the women in the bathhouses about how pregnant they were. In a generation where you see children informing on adults and being part of the death of ethics in a generation, we're in a serious time. And we are in a time of idolatry. It surrounds us on every side. And the fact that he would pull us out of certain forms of idolatry, the most heinous form of idolatry, of course, being pride, worshiping your own will. That's the worst. It's the image is kind of a symptom, but what's wrong is deep inside. So it says, will you judge them? Will you judge them, Son of Man? Make known to them the abominations of their fathers, and say to them, this is what the Lord God says. On the day when I chose Israel and swore to the descendants of the house of Jacob and made myself known to them in the land of Egypt, when I swore to them, saying, I am the Lord your God. On that day, I swore to them to bring them out from the land of Egypt into a land that I had selected for them, flowing with milk and honey, which is the glory of all the lands. So he's saying, I made an intervention in Egypt, and I told them I would take them from there pretty much to the Garden of Eden, because the two of the rivers of Eden are said to flow with milk and honey. He's saying, I can take you, I can transform you where you can live in this land as it was in the Garden of Eden. He says, I said to them, throw away, each of you, the detestable things of his eyes, and do not defile yourselves with the idols of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. But they rebelled against me and were not willing to listen to me. They did not throw away, each of them, the detestable things of their eyes, nor did they abandon the idols of Egypt. Okay, right there, it shows you something that the Torah text doesn't mention. But this helps us see the depths of idolatry that Israel had fallen to. Like I said, what was the difference between them and the Egyptians at this point? There's not a lot separating them. And so he's calling them out. He says, I want you to put away the idols. And it says they didn't want to. He says, then I resolved to pour out my wrath on them, to use up my anger against them in the midst of the land of Egypt. So it sounds as though there was some sort of intervention. Maybe there was a generation, maybe the generation of the 12 brothers, they could see this direction in their children. Maybe they cautioned their children, or maybe it was their children who cautioned their children. I always look at the 60s for the United States as being that generation where, for some reason, the parents were either incapable of or unwilling to discipline their children. It went haywire. It just went totally haywire. I mean, the things were put in place probably in the 50s. It's not like it just spontaneously erupted. There were some things that occurred, maybe going back much farther. But as far as just bursting onto the scene, this happens in the 60s. It gets worse in the 70s. And now we're reaping the reward. We don't want this reward, but this is what we're reaping. And so if there's intervention, however he tried to intervene, the Torah doesn't tell us, but right here, Ezekiel's telling us, he tried to intervene. and they didn't want to give up their idols. And so what happens? He says, I resolved to pour out my wrath on them. We talk about the wrath of the Lamb, and we always think it's going to be directed at everybody else. But he says, I was going to pour out my wrath on them. And in the sense of slavery, in the sense of the death of the baby boys, then of course, this would be an outpouring of wrath. He says, in the midst of the land of Egypt. And he goes on, he says, but I acted for the sake of my name, that it would not be defiled in the sight of the nations among whom they lived, in whose sight I made myself known to them by bringing them out of the land of Egypt. So I took them out of the land of Egypt. See these two wildernesses? He's contending with them in Egypt. He has to bring them to a place, give up your idols so I can bring you out. And apparently you have at least a temporary repentance, you have a circumcision and so forth, so he can bring them out of the land of Egypt. And he says, I took them out of the land of Egypt and brought them into the wilderness. Here's another wilderness. It's not the wilderness of Egypt, it's the wilderness of the people. He says, I gave them statutes so they would have no excuse. If you had a vague idea about Passover, it's going to get much more definite. If you had a vague idea of Shabbat or a vague idea of Sukkot, it's going to get way more definite here. I gave them my statutes and informed them of my ordinances, which if a person follows them, then he will live by them. Another interpretation is going to be he will live in them. Depends on how you translate that bait in the sentence. The deeper understanding, of course, is he will live in them. It kind of this is what informs when you've got two seemingly conflicting commandments. And if I follow this commandment, then I'll probably die. But if I follow this commandment, I will live. And then you have to kind of rank them in weight. Yeshua ran into a lot of the ranking. It's called Kal v'chomer, light and heavy, where you have two commandments that might come into conflict in a certain situation. You choose the one that you live in, right? We tend to emphasize live by them, but the emphasis is live in them. Right? It's live, not die in them. If a person follows them, then he will die by them. All right, he will die in them. That's not what it's saying. It's saying if you're keeping a commandment, it's designed for you to live in it. And so unless you're looking at something like being asked to worship an idol, to commit sexual immorality, there's certain things that, it is better to die than to do those things. But in other cases, if you will live, you live to fight another day. You live, to continue to serve the Holy One. Does it mean you didn't sin? No, it doesn't mean that. It means you still owe a sacrifice for sin. But the idea of choosing life, like for the Orthodox, they won't drive a car on Shabbat because of it has to do with the electrical system and so forth. People think kindling a fire on Shabbat and the fact that they won't turn a light switch on is kindling a fire. That's not the commandment they're going by. It has to do with the opening and the closing of the circuits. Too complicated to go into right now. But what if a woman goes into labor on Shabbat? Will they not call an ambulance? Yes, they will. If you're a Jewish physician, an observant Jewish physician, will you go to work on Shabbat? Yes, you will, because your job is to preserve life. If you're an ambulance driver, your job is to preserve life. Life will be preserved. So in that sense, it's like Yeshua said, the priests are going to serve in the temple on Shabbat. They're going to be dealing with fire all day long. They're going to be slaughtering all day long. But because it's the commandment of the Sabbath, there's an element of life in the temple service that supersedes these supplemental things that underpin it. So this is the idea there. He says, if you will keep these statutes and the ordinances, you will live in them. He says, also, I gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign between me and them, so that they might know that I am the Lord who sanctifies them. So he gives you the broad picture. He says the statutes and the ordinances. He's talking about the conditions of the covenant here. If you didn't know what those were, now you know, you have a list. But then he points out something specific. He says, my Sabbaths. There's more than one kind of Sabbath. There's the weekly Sabbath, and then each of your Moedim has at least one high Sabbath. So he's ranking the Sabbaths up here for us to pay attention to. If you want to be free of Egypt, if you want to be free of the idols of Egypt and all that goes with it, then he's saying pay special attention to the appointed times. Pay special attention to the weekly Sabbath. If you will pay special attention to the weekly Sabbath and to the high Sabbaths of the Moedim, it will be a sign between you and him forever, that through those he will sanctify you from your idols. It's going to be a process. You have to make a choice. I give up my idols. But then do we not tend to slide back to them? Do we not tend to slide back into self-will? Sure we do. But he says, if you will hang in there, if you will observe my appointed times, then we can sever you from the abominations of Egypt. So in this second wilderness, what does he say happened? But the house of Israel rebelled against me in the wilderness. They did not walk in my statutes, and they rejected my ordinances, which if a person follows them, then he will live by them. And they greatly profaned my Sabbaths. See how he keeps bringing up the Sabbaths, the appointed times? He says, then I resolved to pour out my wrath on them in the wilderness to annihilate them. Now, did he annihilate them? No, because Moses interceded. Will he annihilate us today? No, because Yeshua is going to intercede for us. And if you were to read that whole chapter, it's just a repetitious cycle of calling the people to the Sabbaths, to the appointed times, showing how they rebel, and then showing how they're denied the land of milk and honey, which is that upper level of the land. It's the Garden of Eden that you cannot see in the natural realm today, but it's there just waiting, the natural and the spiritual realm to be merged once again. And so he's saying, because of their rebellion, part of my wrath was that I did not allow them to go into the land. So it doesn't mean they never will. It just meant they weren't going directly there. There'd be a stopover at some point. So this is our point. Why do Moses and Aaron keep going back and saying, let us go celebrate a feast? Because of what Ezekiel's saying right here. They were trying to break within the Hebrews the power of idolatry. In order to break the power of idolatry, one step is to begin to observe the Sabbaths and the appointed times. And if you will take those steps, then that process of sanctification truly can get some momentum in your life in terms of putting distance between you and these idols back here. So the Egyptians, they decided to seize the children shrewdly. And that's, what the song is saying, seize these foxes, measure for measure. The foxes have been seizing our children, so we need the Holy One to seize the foxes and to deal with the foxes shrewdly. So the Egyptians, in this need that's written for us in the Song of Songs, we got to catch these foxes. We got to seize them. So the way that they are seized is that they are lured into the Sea of Reeds after they've already been on the receiving end of 10 plagues. And so as the 10 plagues are gradually releasing Israel from the power of idolatry and abominations, at least a certain element of them, but it sounds like there were some of them that never made a complete break with the idolatry and the abominations of idolatry in the wilderness, and they died in the wilderness. But through these 10 plagues, these preliminary steps of separation from idolatry had to take place. And so as it's crumbling, the power of Egypt to hang on to Israel, at the very same time, it's gradually crumbling in terms of the power it does have on the Israelites, to the point, imagine how far they had descended and how they're having to, come up from the absolute bottom of idolatry in order to be able to even hear Moses say, take a lamb, put the blood on the doorpost, eat the lamb, do it this way, follow my instructions exactly. The 10 plagues had to have gotten the attention of the Israelites as much as the Egyptians. They knew that, yes, the God that they were crying out to was powerful and strong. And with his deliverance would also come a purification and sanctification. At the Seder, we have different cups. One of these cups is going to be for sanctification. Kiddush that we do on Erev Shabbat is for sanctification, saying this is part of the process of Shabbat. It brings us through this process of sanctification and creates more distance between us and any abominations we might still be holding on to. And to show you how powerful this delusion of idolatry is, after 10 plagues, wouldn't you think the Egyptians would be terrified to chase the Israelites? I mean, they just lost all their firstborn. They should have been terrified to do anything else concerning the Israelites. Instead, Pharaoh is able to muster his soldiers, and they just plunge ahead. They run to catch up to them. And then as Israel is going across the sea, they think, oh, that's going to be a great idea. I don't know about you guys, but if I came to a sea, I've been down to Eilat before. Let's say it's something that small. And if all of a sudden a wind started blowing and it just separated that sea in front of me and it piled up on two sides, and I could see the dry bed below, I don't think I'd be that eager to plunge in there. I would need, a pillar of fire or something. I would need Moses or something to tell me that's okay. And for the Israelites, they had just experienced 10 great deliverances. And so this was just one more deliverance for them. For the Egyptians, in their minds, seriously, they had just experienced 10 judgments, and they didn't think that was a judgment, just waiting to happen to them. But that shows you how strong the delusion of idolatry and pride that goes with idolatry are. And so with the same measure of death, they had wanted to destroy Israel with the flood of wickedness, they died. Water returned to water. And the Midrash even speculates, just based on some of the language about this particular incident, that some of the soldiers did hesitate, like it did dawn on them that maybe this isn't the greatest idea in the world, Pharaoh. How many times have you ever seen this happen? And and when they hesitated, all of a sudden their horses took control. If you've ever ridden a runaway horse, you know exactly what I'm talking about. They'll just take the bit in their mouth and go. Not a lot you can do except try to turn. And it says their chariot wheels were confused. And so apparently, as they would try to turn the horses, it would just send them in the wrong direction. The confusion set in, but they're lured in. And at that point, it's kind of out of their control. They can't even turn around and go back. They're there. I just thought that was a cool picture. What was the last thing Pharaoh saw? Okay, we don't laugh at the Egyptians. That's one thing we don't do. We don't laugh when people die. But the idea that after all that Pharaoh had done at that point, maybe that was his last view, was looking up at a horse. And it is believed that the soldiers who drowned in the Sea of Reeds were the very ones who were the agents for collecting or seizing the Hebrew boys to drown them in the Nile. And this is a principle called midah keneged midah, and it means measure against measure. And this kind of lends support to the idea, because the citation takes us back to Isaiah 40, verses 11 through 12. It says, like a shepherd, he will tend his flock. In his arm, he will gather the lambs and carry them in the fold of his robe. He will gently lead the nursing ewes. Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, and measured the heavens with a span, and calculated the dust of the earth with a measure, and weighed the mountains in a balance, and the hills in a pair of scales. So the context here is, he is going to take care of Israel like a shepherd takes care of a flock. He's not going to push them too hard. He's going to keep them safe. And then it says something a little odd. It says, who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand. If you look at that phrase there in Hebrew, mi madad, be sha'alo mayim, be sha'alo, right? The hollow of his hand, be sha'alo. Well, that should sound familiar, because you know the word for fox is shual, shual. So it's a little play on words there. He has done what? He has measured out the waters, basically, of the fox. As the fox has seized the blossoms, so he has seized the fox by measuring out the waters in the hollow of his hand. He had already, before, possibly on day 3 of creation, I would guess, because this, of course, is when the waters are gathered and when the dry land appears, and therefore the rivers and the streams and lakes and those sorts of things would also have appeared on the 3rd day. There was separation of waters on the 2nd day, but the gathering of the waters, which would lead to rivers and so forth, on the 3rd day. Possibly at that time in the creation, he went ahead and measured out the waters in the hollow of his hand and calculated the dust of the earth with measure. And he knew exactly where the Egyptians would go, and he knew exactly where they would be drowned. They would be drowned in the dust of the earth, because remember, they're crossing on a dry seabed. So waters and earth. And the hollow of his hand there is sha'al, sha'al. So what does the fox do? It burrows out the hollow. Well, what has the fox done in this case? He has burrowed out his burial place in the hollow of Adonai's hand. What was it? It was a Steinbeck book, but I can't remember who he was quoting. It says the best laid plans of mice and men have often gone awry. Well, this old fox got outfoxed. So sha'al, the palm of the hand, the hollow of the hand. And this is why I said kind of file away the 2 spellings of the fox in 2:15, because they point out that in older manuscripts that in Psalm 2:15, Song 2:15, that the first use of foxes, shualim, is written in its full form. So that's the first Hebrew word there. If you can't read it, it says shualim. And you'll notice, if you do know your letters, there is a vav in shualim. The vav is a vowel in that case. You don't pronounce it. Shualim. They say the second time, the little foxes. In these older manuscripts, the second use is abbreviated. It's written without a vav, and you just simply vowelize the sheen. You say shualim. It's pronounced the same. It's just that you're dropping the vav. In Hebrew, you can do that because of the nature of a vowel. It's often not there. It's understood. And you would only know that if you were reading something with vowel points. So you break apart this second spelling. Remember, there's lots of wordplay in the Song of Songs. If you break apart the second spelling, because the question is, well, why would it be spelled two different ways within the same sentence? Shualim, shualim, why drop the vav in the second foxes? Well, if you break that word apart, what you come up with is sha'al yam. The fox went down to the palm of the sea. He went down to the hollow of the sea. And this is where it had already been measured out for their destruction. And so you can see how, again, especially with the older manuscripts, all the words are pretty much smushed together. You would have to know where one word started and stopped. And so in this case, as you're reading, you would very naturally read this play on word, sha'al yam. The fox went down to the palm of the sea. And that's what happened to Pharaoh. So Psalm 63, 8 through 10, it says, my soul clings to you. Think of the Israelites standing at the Sea of Reeds, wondering, what do we do now? And they cried out to Adonai. And so Moses cries out to Adonai and he says, why are you crying out to me? Basically, I've already heard them. And so Moses just says, be silent, just stand still here and watch. So he opens the sea up, they walk through on the dry land, they come up on the other side. And so put your mind in that mindset as you read this. My soul clings to you. Your right hand takes hold of me. Kind of goes back again to the hand. They've been delivered from the hand of Pharaoh. And now, they've been delivered from the hand of the fox. And so now the right hand of Adonai takes hold. It says, your right hand takes hold of me. But those who seek my life to destroy it will go into the depths of the earth. They will be turned over to the power of the sword. They will be a prey or a portion for foxes. So this is, again, just alluding to the fox, it gives us a context. It's helping us understand the role of Egypt in terms of our own patterns, our own parallels. So in this fox psalm, you can see an equivalent expression. It's saying this thing has something in common or is similar to this thing. They're not identical, but in some cases, these words can be interchangeable. In this case, the equivalency is that the power of the sword, and we're interested in this because the sword is one of the four altar judgments of Revelation. So it equates the sword, the power of the sword, to falling prey to foxes, right? So you say, okay, there's four altar judgments, but there's all sorts of tribulation in the earth. All those sorts of tribulation in the earth can very likely be traced back to 10 plagues. And of those 10 plagues, all 10 can be traced back to the four altar judgments. They are some derivation of the four altar judgments. So this helps us as we're trying to think through the four altar judgments, like, okay, what's the power of the sword? Well, part of falling under the power of the sword is going to be in the category of falling prey to foxes. The Egyptians were the foxes who preyed upon the Hebrew children. They did so with cunning. They did so through the power of keen observation. They didn't try to do it with a mighty military. even though, in fact, they used Hebrew, we would call them trustees, I guess, in a prison setting, but they used Hebrews to keep the Hebrews in line. Practice that still goes on today in prisons, where the prison administrators give trusted positions to inmates like Joseph. And they in turn are part of, like at the institution where I worked, our blood cleanup crew was all inmates who had been trained by medical services. So after we have a stabbing or whatever, once the crime scene is lifted and everybody can go back to work, they call in the inmate blood spill crew, and they come in and they clean up the blood spill until it reaches a certain degree of sanitation. So they have a trusted position. We also had inmate suicide observers. They were volunteers, and they could volunteer if we had an inmate on suicide watch. They weren't in the room with that particular inmate, but they had a visual. There was a window there. They could talk to the other inmate, encourage him, just be there, alert staff if the inmate did something that looked like he was making a move toward hurting himself in some way. And so he volunteered for this, and actually got paid for it. You know, there were perks to this. It looks really good on your resume if you're going, if you're trying to get early release or whatever, that you've done something for the good of mankind. And so the Egyptians used this technique. They would take Hebrews to oversee the work of the Hebrews. Very cunning. It made them less of the heavy. And imagine being put in that position. Think of the Holocaust stories you've heard, where certain Jews were put in charge of cleaning up the ovens, put in charge of sorting through the clothes and the valuables and these sorts of things. Being put in that position, it's the most humiliating thing ever, because you're kind of two kinds of slave at that point. But this is a very cunning practice. And the Nazis did it the same way the Egyptians did it. But this predatory nature of the fox, it's not the most powerful, it's not the fastest, but it is a very intelligent, animal smart practice of observing your prey and figuring out the smartest way possible to control them and preserve your territory. However you choose to use them. For a fox, a real fox, he's just going to eat the chicken. But often, you'll see them observe the chickens for months on end. And then, if it's a lean week and there's nothing else to eat, which right now, we just went into, finally started acting like winter here. And so I guess the food dried up somewhere. What does he do? He goes in one night and he wipes out the chicken house that he's probably been spying on for 2 years. But this is often what the fox is motivated by, not just putting food in his belly, but foxes have a territorial claim. This is how an Egyptian works. They're not an offensive squad primarily, they're a defensive squad. And the offense that they do run is really their best defense, because they're more about defending territory than mustering a huge army and conquering nations. That's not really their thing. They just want to protect what's theirs. And the power of the sword is to fall prey to this mentality of territorialism. That's what motivated Egypt, territorialism. The text tells us that's what it was all about. So as we hear the footsteps of Messiah, and as we learn these prophecies in the Song of Songs, we understand that as the footsteps draw nearer, helping us to think about Pesach, helping us to think about the Exodus from Egypt, and all of the events that are very carefully recorded for us, then we need to understand the mindset of the fox. We don't have to kind of sit around and just wait for the next wave of crazy. The next wave of crazy is coming, but they're crazy like a fox, because what they're doing very often is the result of carefully observing what they perceive to be a threat, coming up with a plan. And in this particular instance with the Egyptians, what the sages are pointing out is they pulled the children into the plan because nobody suspected the children. But they indoctrinated the children, and that's what we saw the Nazis do. They indoctrinated their children with things like Nazi youth. They taught them killing skills. They taught them hate skills. So they took a generation, and it's still prevalent. It's not gone. Just because they lost the war doesn't mean that mindset is gone. In fact, it's still out there in the world. It's not confined to one geographical location, just like Israel's not confined to one geographical location. This mindset has spread out there in the world. And the foxes are observing their enemy. They are observing what they know can overthrow their government. They're observing what they know can overthrow their religion. They are observing what they know can overthrow their economy. This idea that human can be God. They are observing anyone and anything that might undercut that position, that human is God. And everything we're about says human is not God. Beast is not God. We are made in the image of Elohim. There's a huge difference between conforming to the image of Elohim and believing that you are. This is what Pharaoh thought. It had infected his entire nation. They thought he was God, and he wasn't. And so, let's see how far we got to go. I thought we'd get to the story again of Henny Penny and Billy Idol. I'll go ahead and tell you the story. And then we'll go into it next week. There she is. There's Billy Idol. And like I say, those of you who have been in the class for a few years will remember this story. It's a true story. And the neighbors that got their chickens wiped out last week, same neighbors. They, of course, are having fox problems, maybe for the benefit of our class. I don't know. I sure hope not. But when our neighbors got their chickens, they had finally got up to the age of pullets. If you lived on a farm, you know about what size a pullet is. They're not full grown, but they're not chicks either. And this tends to be the age when predators take notice. For some reason, they don't pay much attention to them when they're chicks. And they're a little more cautious when they're grown. But once they reach pullet size, it seems like they're more attractive to a predator at that point. Even your domestic dog will go after the pullets sometimes. So what they had is they had all these red and black pullets running all over the place. You know, they've been cooped up as little chicks under the heat lamp and all that. And now they're free. And somehow in their batch that they got from the farm supply, one little chicken got put in there that did not match the others. It's like, which one of these chickens doesn't belong? And so it was this white one. And we nicknamed it Billy Idol because she had this spiky hairdo like the rock star. And Billy Idol would team up with one we called Henny Penny. She was a red one, like most of the others, little red hen. And then there was Billy Idol, and they stuck together. I guess they were chicken buddies. And they would come over to our house a lot. Of course, we had a fresh garden, and fresh garden equals good scratching. We had raised beds, and if they can get in those raised beds, they'll just tear it up. But it's nice, soft earth they can scratch in. And every day, about every time I would look out there, they had crossed under the fence and they were all over our 5 acres. And so we'd shoo them back on their side because I knew there was a game trail right where they were scratching for foxes. Those foxes have been there since we moved in. Sometimes you could go out in the evenings and they'd be playing down at the end of our barn. And if you just stayed still and they didn't know you were there, you just see like the whole family, they would just bounce and roll and play. And so I've just enjoyed them because they didn't really have anything we were worried about losing. So we kept shooing Henny Penny and Billy Idol back to the other side of the fence, and they'd be right back there. And what they thought was a great scratching area, that game trail, well, that game trail ended in a deadfall back at the back of our property. And there was a little entrance at that deadfall. And I just happened to know that there was a little fox family that lived there. And so one afternoon, Henny Penny and Billy Idol went missing. And the neighbors called, have you seen Henny Penny and Billy Idol? We're like, no, we haven't seen them, all afternoon, actually. We'd seen them that morning, but we hadn't seen them that afternoon. And so they looked and they looked and they looked and they looked. And I went out and looked, and I had a pretty good idea where they went. And so I went down that game trail to where the foxes live, and that's about all there was a feather. So, but if you'll remember the story of Henny Penny, it's a pretty funny story. She thought the sky was falling. And in a nutshell, the parallel I tried to make was that sometimes it's hard for us to trust the boundaries. And in a time like this, where there's plague and it seems like life is out of control, we might think the sky is falling. We might think heaven is not in control. We might think the Father is just absent, uninterested, disinterested. And we'll get out there and we'll act like Billy Idol and Henny Penny, and we'll just be all over the place. But what they did is they didn't understand there was a fence there for a reason. Because if they got on our side of the fence, there were foxes. If they had stayed in the chicken yard, if they had stayed in the neighbor's yard, at least during the daytime, they would have been safe. And that's what the Torah is for us. It's a fence. And if we'll just be aware that it's there and say that real happiness is going to be found within its boundaries. Going outside of those boundaries is basically idolatry. It's the pride of thinking either God will notice or heaven is somehow failing in its responsibilities to keep an eye on me. At any rate, we feel a sense of disconnection with the Holy One. And therefore, that freedom will stretch a little more, stretch a little more, stretch a little more. And pretty soon, that free-range chicken becomes a chicken with no boundaries. Our free range is within the Torah of liberty, as James calls it. That's where we get life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, within those boundaries. And Eden is called a locked garden because there's only life in there. You come out of that garden, you lose life. And so we don't want to be like Billy Idol and Henny Penny. We don't want to venture outside the boundaries because waiting for us out there, again, is the pride of idolatry, of thinking we set the boundaries. And that's what Billy Idol and Henny Penny did. They set their own boundaries. Now, could the neighbors have done more to keep them in? Yeah. But, that's kind of the reality of farm life. It's just as an example. But after that, they did improve their fencing, and now the chickens can't get over here. In that case, the fox got into the hen house, created a new problem, and that'll preach too. But at any rate, especially in a time like this where we feel like the sky is falling, and that somehow heaven can't sustain us, that somehow the Father cannot perform that which he has said he will perform in our lives and bring us into life and bring us into that locked garden, that's not true. It's not true. He is in total control. Whether we're talking about the 4 altered judgments and the things that the foxes might do to us, because remember, they're watching us. They're observing us. They know our habits. They know where our trails are. Just like a fox, he will figure out where the trap line is, and he will run those trap lines looking to pick up prey the easy way. And see, we don't need to make it easy. The snare is what you want that is outside of the Father's will. And we can all sit here right now and probably think of 1, 2, 3 things that in my world, if I were God, these are the things I would want for myself. And these are the things that have snared us before. It's our ideas about the way life should be instead of the Father's ideas of the way life should be. And so we will be susceptible in those areas. How was Esau snared? His appetite for food, his appetite for women. So you see how the soul, your appetite, emotion, desire, and intellect, what you want, your desire in those areas will become the snares that will entrap you. And the fox is smart enough to know that. So he's going to hang around in those places to try to seize you when you fall into those traps. And see, with the Israelites falling into that trap of idolatry, all the fox needed to do was hang out in those places and then observe the behavior and then to seize. Once they had fallen for the snare of idolatry, once they had fallen for the trap of idolatry, right? So we have to be that smart to know that the fox is watching us. He is looking for an opportunity to ruin the vineyard. That's what the fox does. He ruins the vineyard. The vineyard is Israel. You are the vineyard. You are blossoming. You are giving forth a fragrance because it goes back to the feast. Remember what they were saying? The blossoms, can't you smell the blossoms? We have to go celebrate the feast. And Pharaoh says, oh no. And so as you maintain that, you maintain your blossom status. You know, you can smell a good feast from a mile away, right? You can smell Passover. Can you not smell a Passover Seder right now if I say it? Can you smell the apples and the cinnamon? Can you taste the horseradish? Can you smell the wine or the grape juice? You see the blossoms at work right there? There's a fragrance that's associated with Passover. What about Sukkot? Can you smell the etrog? Can you smell the myrtle branches? There is a fragrance associated with our feast, and you're beginning to smell those fragrances and respond to them. So in you is the promise of the vineyard at Sukkot, when all this wine comes in for the water pouring ceremony. You are part of that promise. And what the fox is going to do, he's going to try to get in your vineyard. He's going to observe you carefully. He's going to find the weak place in your vineyard. He's going to figure out what it is you'll fall for every time. And that's where he's going to hang out. And that's where he will seize you and hold you. And so you have to figure out what the idolatry is in your life. What preferences or desires in your life have you placed above the desire of the Holy One? you get that thing in shape, then you're ready for a trip. You're ready for the wilderness of Egypt, and you're ready for the wilderness of the people. And you'll go into the land flowing with milk and honey. And so Baruch Hashem, these things are written down for us. This is our guideline. This is our flight plan. This is our hiking path. However we get there, we just go back to these Torah portions. And with the Song of Songs, it's kind of it's helping us make those connections, I think. And it's taking that Exodus and it's helping us to internalize our own Exodus and see it as a present thing, not something that happened like, this is what happened to me when I came out of Egypt. You read Song of Songs and you get that. This is what's happening to me as I'm coming out of Egypt.